On the morning of the 17th of April, 1886, a woman in a mourning dress that had begun, by the calendar, to lighten from full black to the lavender and grey of the second year of widowhood, walked up the steps of the federal building in Fort Smith, Arkansas, with a 10-month-old child on her left hip and a Smith & Wesson's Schofield revolver in a leather satchel on her right. She was 28 years old. Her husband had been dead 7 months and 6 days. She had ridden a passenger car from Charleston to St. Louis and the Frisco line from St. Louis to Fort Smith, and she had not slept in a bed since the 2nd of April, and the satchel on her right shoulder held also the deed to a house on Trad Street and a letter from her father, which she had not yet opened. The clerk at the marshal's office looked at the child, then at the woman, then at the satchel. He was about to tell her that the office did not, on most mornings, receive ladies, and that if she had a complaint about a Charleston matter, she would do better at the county court. Then he looked at the way her left hand cradled the child, and the way her right hand rested, palm flat, on the strap of the satchel. Not on the child, on the satchel. And he stopped speaking. The records on this part are thin, and I would not swear to the exact words, but a clerk who later signed a deposition on a different case wrote that on that April morning, a Charleston widow walked into the office and asked, in a voice that had not been raised above conversational tone, for an audience with Judge Parker himself. Within an hour, she had it. Isaac Charles Parker was 48 years old. He had been on the bench of the United States District Court for the Western District of Arkansas 11 years. He had, by the spring of '86, sentenced enough men to hang that the figures had ceased to surprise anyone in Fort Smith. The running totals of his career are in the federal records, and I will not pretend to a number for this exact April. And many of those condemned had already been hanged in the courtyard he could see from his window. And he was, by every account I have read, a man of progressive temperament on the subject of women. He was about to be tested on the point. Caroline Ashworth McGrath put the child on the rug at her feet. The boy was named James, and he was called Jamie, and he was the kind of infant who does not cry unless he is hungry or cold, a fact which would matter later. And she stood in front of the judge's desk, and she said, "My husband was Robert McGrath. He was your deputy. He was killed on the 11th of September last at Hanging Tree Hill in the Cherokee Nation by 3 men. Their names are Marlon, Cyrus, and Daniel Hayden. I have come to ask for a warrant." Parker looked at her a long moment. Then he looked at the boy on the rug, who was, at that moment, attempting to put his own foot into his mouth, and not entirely failing. "Madam," said Parker, "you have my deepest condolences." The warrant was issued in October. Deputy Reeves has been on the trail since November. He has not, as of last Friday's report, made an arrest. "I know that," Caroline said. "I want a warrant of my own." Parker put both palms flat on his desk. He did not laugh. He did not, by the testimony of the clerk who was present, even change expression. He said, very carefully, "Mrs. McGrath, you are aware that the deputy marshals of this court are required to track armed fugitives through territory that recognizes no white law, that they sleep on the ground and ride 16 hours a day, that my deputies are, on average, killed at a rate of 1 every 7 months. You are aware that your son is 10 months old?" 11 months tomorrow, Caroline said. "And you propose to take him on the trail?" "I propose to take him to Tahlequah, which is 2 days from here, on a good road, and from Tahlequah to the household of his godmother, Mrs. Ada Worcester, who is connected by marriage to the Park Hill Mission family and lives in a stone house with a Cherokee housekeeper. I propose to leave him there. I propose to ride alone after that." Parker said nothing. "My father was Judge Henry Ashworth of the Court of Common Pleas, Charleston District," Caroline said. "He taught me to shoot a Smith & Wesson Schofield in the year 1876 in the courtyard of the St. Cecilia Gun Club, on the consideration that the Ku Klux were threatening the families of jurists who had ruled for freedmen. I have shot it every fortnight since. My husband was killed by the Hayden brothers in such a way that the body was left in the open for 3 days because the deputies who came to recover it could not, at first, identify it. I have read the inquest report. I have read the autopsy. I have read Deputy Reeves's field notes. I want a warrant. I will pay my own expenses. I will swear the oath. If you refuse me, I will go to Tahlequah anyway, and I will swear in front of the Cherokee Light Horse, and I will hunt them under their commission, which I have already been promised by Captain Beau Adair in correspondence that began in February." "You wrote to a light horse captain in February," Parker said. "I wrote to 7 men in February," Caroline said. 3 of them answered. 2 said I should go home. The 3rd said he would meet me at the Tahlequah depot on the 22nd of April. The judge looked at the satchel again, then at the boy, then at the woman. Then he said, "Mrs. McGrath, show me the revolver." She put it on the desk. It was a Smith & Wesson Schofield .45, 4.5-inch barrel, ivory grip with a Latin motto cut into the side, "Suum cuique," to each his own, and a small set of initials below the trigger guard which were not her own. She turned the cylinder, 5 chambers, 1 empty, hammer down on the empty. She set the revolver on the desk with the muzzle pointing at the wall and the grip pointing toward the judge, and she stepped back. "That is the proper way to lay down a revolver in the presence of a magistrate," Parker said. "My father is a magistrate," Caroline said. Parker turned and looked out of his window. The view from the window of the judge's chamber in the federal building on that April morning included, by every account I have read of the room, the courtyard in which the gallows stood. A 6-man gallows of the design which had been objected to in the Eastern press, but which Parker had defended as a matter of administrative efficiency. And beyond the courtyard, the Arkansas River, and beyond the river, the line of trees that marked the beginning of the Indian Territory. Parker looked at that line of trees for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he turned around. "Send for the prosecutor," he said. The Assistant United States Attorney on duty that morning came in from the next room. He was carrying a sheet of warrant paper. "Swear her in," Parker said. "6-month commission, specific to the 3 named. No other arrests, no other duties. She rides under federal commission as a special deputy in pursuit of named fugitives, and she answers to me in person on her return." "Sir," said the prosecutor, who was the kind of lawyer who paid attention to the legal questions, "the precedent." "There is no precedent," Parker said. "Make one." Caroline McGrath took the oath at 37 minutes past 10 on the morning of the 17th of April. The warrant, which I have held, the original, is in the Western District papers at the Fort Smith National Historic Site, and I have stood in the room where it is kept. Bears Parker's signature in the rapid, forward-leaning hand he used when he was certain of a thing. The expiry date is October 17th, 1886. 6 months. After that, The commission was void, and the woman, if she had not made her arrests, was a private citizen carrying a warrant nobody would honor. She walked out of the building at 11 o'clock. Jamie was on her hip. The Schofield was, this time, on the front of her belt, under the half-mourning shawl. She walked across the courtyard, past the gallows. The 6-man gallows was empty that morning because the next hanging was scheduled for the 2nd of May. And down to the boarding house on Garrison Avenue, where she had taken a room for the week. And she sat on the edge of the bed, and she wrote 2 letters. The first was to her father in Charleston. It contained 1 sentence, which I will paraphrase because I have only the second draft in pencil from her papers in the Charleston Historical. She had her commission. She would write again from Tahlequah, and she begged her father not to take the train to Fort Smith because there was nothing he could do that she could not do herself. The second letter was to her brother-in-law in Savannah and contained the address of the boarding house, a copy of the warrant in case anything went wrong, and instructions for the disposition of the Trad Street house in the event of her death. The brother-in-law was an attorney. He understood the document. He filed it. It is also in the Charleston papers. She sealed both letters at 3. She fed Jamie at 4. At 5, she walked down to Garrison Avenue to the gunsmith and bought 100 rounds of .45 Schofield ammunition and a small leather and canvas saddle holster of the model that had been favored by the wartime cavalry. The gunsmith was a man named Adcock, who had served 3 years with the 2nd Arkansas Federal Cavalry. He looked at her dress and her child and her revolver, and he asked her if she wanted any advice. She said she did. He told her 2 things, both of which appear in his deposition 6 months later. He told her that the Schofield was the right gun for a person of her build because the top break action could be reloaded with one hand, and he told her never to draw the gun unless she had already decided to fire it. She thanked him. She paid him in cash. She walked back to the boarding house with Jamie on her shoulder, asleep. By 6, the air had turned. There was thunder over the Indian Territory hills. The spring storms in that country come fast, and they come from the southwest. And Caroline stood at the window of the boarding house and watched the line of trees on the far side of the river darken under cloud. She had not, since Robert's death, allowed herself the indulgence of a long look at any horizon. She allowed it now. The horizon was, on that evening, not a comforting thing. It was a thing that contained 3 men, somewhere, who had killed her husband by tying him to a tree and shooting him in the legs first and then in the chest, and who had taken his deputy's badge as a souvenir, and who were, by the report of a Choctaw freedman in McAllister 2 weeks ago, last seen riding north toward the verdigris. I have a copy of the letter she wrote to her father that night. I have read it twice, once in transcription and once in her own hand at the Charleston Historical, where it lies in a glassine sleeve next to the deed to the Trad Street house. The handwriting in that letter is steady. The ink is the cheap kind sold at frontier general stores. Adcock, the gunsmith, carried it as a sideline. The contents are not steady. I will not quote them, because there is a paragraph in that letter which is meant for a father, and not for a stranger 90 years later. I will say only that she signed it with the diminutive her father had used for her as a child, which was Lena, which she had not signed in any letter since the year of her marriage. She slept 4 hours that night. At 3 in the morning, the boarding house woman came to her door because there was a man downstairs. The man downstairs was tall. He wore a Stetson, which he did not, in the foyer, remove. He wore his hair to his collar. He wore a six-pointed star on the left lapel of a long canvas duster, and the star said, Deputy U.S. Marshal, and the duster was stained at the cuff with what was certainly not coffee. He was Bass Reeves. He was 48 years old. He had ridden in from the Verdigris country at midnight, on a horse that he had then walked the last 6 miles to spare its legs. He had come, he said, because the night clerk at the Federal Building had told him, at 1 in the morning, that Judge Parker had today sworn in a widow with a baby. He had come to inform her that she would, with all respect, be turning around. Caroline came down the boarding house stairs in her dressing gown, with the Schofield in the right pocket and Jamie in her left arm, and she met Bass Reeves at the foot of the stairs. By every account I have read of the encounter, and the accounts include Reeves's own, given to a Muskogee newspaperman in 1891, and Caroline's, given to her father by post in May of '86, neither of them raised their voices. Mrs. McGrath, said Reeves, I knew your husband. He was a good man. I was at his burial. I have been after the Hayden brothers since the 3rd week of October. I have been into their mother's house in Missouri twice. I have ridden the length of the Verdigris and the breadth of the Potawatomi, and I have not laid hands on them. I am telling you this so you understand what you are asking the judge to send you into. You are not going to find them. You are going to leave that child an orphan. Mr. Reeves, Caroline said, you are 5 feet 11 inches tall, and your skin is dark, and you ride at the front of every posse that hears you are in the country. The Hayden brothers know your face. They have known your face for 6 months. They have a man at every crossing on the Verdigris who knows your face. They do not know mine. Reeves looked at her a long moment. Then he looked at Jamie, who had, in the manner of small children awakened at 3 in the morning, fixed his unblinking attention on the Stetson. You are not wrong about that, Reeves said. I am rarely wrong about a thing I have studied, Caroline said. I have studied this for 7 months. Reeves did not move. There is a kind of stillness particular to men who have spent 40 years in the saddle and who have, in that time, taught themselves to think before they speak. He used it now. He said finally, Where do you mean to leave the child? Tahlequah. Mrs. Ada Worcester. I know Mrs. Worcester. She is a sensible woman. She is my husband's cousin by marriage. I know that also. He was quiet again. Then he said, I am riding north tomorrow. I am following a report from the Potawatomi. If you mean to ride to Tahlequah, you may ride in my company as far as the Canadian River. I will see you across. After that, you are on your own commission and I am on mine. And if our paths cross in the territory, we will exchange information as deputies of the same court. That is generous of you, Mr. Reeves. It is not generous. It is the minimum that the judge will require of me. I am also informing you that I do not approve. Noted. He turned to go. At the door, he stopped and turned back. He took the Stetson off, which he had not done in the foyer, and he held it across his chest, in the way that a man who has been raised in a certain kind of household holds a hat in the presence of a woman in mourning. He said, I was at the burial, Mrs. McGrath. I helped to dig. There were 4 of us, and the ground was hard. I have not, since that day, said your husband's name out loud, because the men who killed him are still in the country, and I do not say the names of dead deputies until the warrants are closed. When this warrant is closed, I will say his name, and I will say it in the courtyard, and I will say it loud. He put the Stetson back on. He left. Caroline stood in the foyer of the boarding house at 3:15 in the morning of the 18th of April, 1886, with her son asleep on her shoulder and a revolver in her dressing gown pocket. And she looked at the door which Bass Reeves had just closed, and she allowed herself, for the first time in 7 months and 6 days, to imagine the possibility that the thing she had set out to do was a thing she would actually accomplish. Then she went upstairs, and she packed. She left Fort Smith at 6 in the morning. The stage to Tahlequah ran 3 times a week. The Wednesday stage was the slow one. 6 passengers, 4 horses, 21 miles to the Canadian River. Change of horses at Weber's Falls. Ferry across. 12 more miles to Tahlequah by sundown. She bought 2 seats, one for herself and one for the cradle box she had paid the boarding house carpenter to build out of pine and canvas at midnight. The cradle box fit the seat exactly. Jamie fit the cradle box. Caroline rode with the Schofield in her lap under a black traveling cloak, and she did not, for the entire 21 miles to Weber's Falls, take her right hand off the grip. At the Canadian River ferry, there were 2 men who looked at her too long. One of them had a pearl-handled Colt and was missing the upper joint of his left ring finger. The other had a federal badge that did not match his clothes. The star was clean, the clothes were trail-stained, and the badge was on the wrong side of the coat. Caroline noticed both. She also noticed that Bass Reeves was, by the ferry pylons, watering his horse without looking in her direction at all, and that his right hand was resting, palm flat, on the grip of his own revolver. The 2 men noticed it too. They got back on their own horses and rode south at a walk that was not quite a walk. Reeves did not look up. She crossed the Canadian at noon. She rode the rest of the way to Tahlequah in the stage with the Schofield in her lap, and Jamie, who was teething, asleep against her shoulder. She got to Mrs. Worcester's stone house at sundown. Mrs. Ada Worcester was 61 years old, connected by marriage to the missionary family whose patriarch, Samuel Austin Worcester, had been the plaintiff in Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, and she was herself a woman who had lived in the Cherokee Nation since she was 4. She met Caroline at her gate in a black wool shawl and a steel-gray braid down to her waist, and she did not say anything until Caroline had handed her Jamie. She held the baby for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice that had the particular cadence of a person who has spoken Cherokee and English for 55 years and has thought in both. "He looks like Robert." "I know," Caroline said. "How long do you want me to keep him?" 6 months. By the 17th of October, I will either have come for him or you will have a letter from Judge Parker. Mrs. Worcester looked at her. Then she looked at the satchel on Caroline's hip, and at the Schofield in the front of her belt, and at the cuffs of the morning sleeves, on which there was, by April, the beginning of the wear that a woman who rides every day begins to put on her cuffs. "You have a light horse permit?" "Captain Adair is meeting me at the depot in the morning. Adair is a good man. He is part Cherokee through his mother, and the light horse, trust him. If he gives you the permit, you may ride in the nation without trouble from our people. The trouble will be from yours." "I know." Caroline. "Yes. Robert was my second cousin's son. I dandled him on this very porch when he was younger than this child. You will bring him to me when this is finished. You will bring him to me yourself. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "If you do not, then I will know. And if I know, I will go down to Fort Smith myself, and I will stand in front of Judge Parker and I will tell him what I think of a court that sends a widow to do its work." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Wooster held Jamie a moment longer. Then she handed him back, briefly, and Caroline kissed the top of his head, where the hair was still the fine, pale gold of an infant, and would turn by autumn to the colour his father's had been. She did not, by her own account, in a letter to her father, allow herself to look at him for very long. She handed him back to Mrs. Wooster. She turned, and she walked down the steps of the stone house, and she did not look back, because she had read, somewhere in the Greek which her father had made her translate as a child, that Orpheus had looked back, and that this was the lesson of that story, and she did not look back. If you came to this story for the kind of woman who carried her Schofield in one hand and her child's photograph in the other, the small button beneath this video keeps these accounts where they belong, on the channel and out of the algorithm's reach. That is all I will ask of you. The next morning at 6, Captain Beau Adair of the Cherokee Light Horse met her at the depot. He was 34 years old, half Cherokee through his mother, half Scots-Irish through his father, and he wore his hair short and his moustache long, and a light horse star which was made of beaten silver and had been struck the year before by a Tahlequah silversmith. He held out his right hand, which Caroline shook, and he said, in the careful English of a man who had been to school both in Tahlequah and in St. Louis, "Mrs. McGrath, I have the permit. It is good for 6 months in the Cherokee Nation, and I have written to Captain Spring of the Choctaw Light Horse, who will issue you a parallel for the Choctaw Nation should you cross south." The Hayden brothers were seen on the 2nd of April near Pryor Creek. They were 3. The middle one, Cyrus, was wearing a deputy's badge on his lapel. "My husband's badge," Caroline said. "That is my understanding, yes." She did not, by Adair's later account, change expression. She said, "Captain Adair, may I ask you something?" "You may." "In your view, and you have ridden after these men, I know you have, you wrote to me on the 18th of February, what is the weakness in their party?" Adair considered. He was a man who answered after he had considered, not before. He said finally, "The youngest, Daniel. He has been drunk since the burial. He is not riding well. He is the one who, if we are patient, will separate. The older 2 will know better, but Daniel will sit too long at a fire one night, and he will be alone. And that is the one you take first. Take him alive if you can. Judge Parker wants testimony on the other 2. If Daniel will testify, the older 2 will hang on his word." Where do I begin? You begin at Pryor Creek. There is a Cherokee woman there named Sarah Talina, who lives with her infant daughter in a one-room cabin on the second bend of the creek above the ford. 2 months ago, 3 white men took her last horse and 3 weeks of forage. She did not report it because she is not a citizen of any nation that would hear her complaint. But she remembers them. I have arranged for her to expect you on the 25th. She speaks English. She has, as it happens, also a piece of information about which road they took out of her hollow that none of my people have been told, because none of my people have asked her, for a reason which I will leave for her to explain. I will leave for Pryor Creek today. You will leave tomorrow, Adair said. Today you will eat, you will sleep, and you will ride a horse of mine, which I have selected, because the stage mares are not what you want for this country. The horse is a 16-hand bay gelding, 8 years old, called Halloo. He has been ridden through the Potawatomi 3 times, and he does not spook at gunfire. He is yours for the duration of your commission. I have asked one thing of you in return.
What is that?
That on the 18th of October, when this is finished, you will return him to me in person. Not by any rider, by you. I have a personal interest in this animal and in the woman who will ride him. Caroline looked at him a long moment. She was, by every account I have, not a woman who flushed easily. Charleston ladies of that generation did not flush. They did other things, more interesting and less visible. But a deputy in the depot office later wrote in his diary, and his diary is also in the archives, that the light horse captain and the widow from South Carolina stood at the depot rail for the length of perhaps 3 breaths without speaking, and that after the 3rd breath she said, in a perfectly level voice, "That, Captain Adair, is a condition I can meet." She rode out of Tahlequah at 6 o'clock on the morning of the 19th of April, 1886. The bay gelding called Halloo was steady under her. The Schofield was on the front of her belt, under her riding cloak. The light horse permit was in the breast pocket of her habit, folded once, sealed with the wax of the Cherokee Nation. The road north toward Pryor Creek was empty. She had not, since the morning of the 11th of September, 1885, ridden a horse alone in country where a man might shoot at her. She rode. Pryor Creek runs through a country of low oak hills and red bottomland in what was, in 1886, the northern part of the Cherokee Nation, and what is now a town in Mays County, Oklahoma, with a Walmart and a Sonic and a stone marker by the highway commemorating the post office that opened on this site in 1871. The cabin at the second bend of the creek above the ford is no longer there. I have walked the place. The foundation stones are visible if you know where to look. They are in a stand of black walnut on a 1/4 acre that the Bureau of Indian Affairs surveyed in 1906, and that has been, since the Dawes allotment, in the name of 3 successive Cherokee families. The current allottee, Mrs. Janet Pigeon, was kind enough, when I visited in the summer of 1979, to walk me down to the bend of the creek and to point out where, by her grandmother's account, Sarah Talina had kept her horse before the white men took it. Caroline reached the cabin on the afternoon of the 25th of April. She had ridden 6 days north from Tahlequah, sleeping each night in the open under an oilcloth she had bought at the Weber's Falls store, and she had not, in those 6 days, spoken to another human being for more than the length of a transaction over a meal. The country between the Canadian and the Verdigris in April is not empty. There are Cherokee homesteads every 6 or 7 miles. The road carries traders, and the spring rains had brought a kind of brilliant green to the bottomland that I have not, in my own travels, ever seen elsewhere. But a woman riding alone is a person about whom strangers ask questions, and Caroline had answered the few questions she could not avoid with the truth, which was that she was bound for the cabin of Sarah Talina on light horse business. That was a sentence which, repeated 3 times along the road, gained her safe passage and a quantity of cold cornbread. She had not, in those 6 days, looked at the photograph of Jamie, which Mrs. Worcester had pressed into her saddle wallet on the morning she left Tahlequah. The cabin was small. 1 room, a chimney of fieldstone, a roof of clapboard that had been re-shingled too recently to match the color of the walls. There was a goat tethered to a stump in the yard. There was a woman sitting on the threshold with a child on her lap. The child was perhaps 14 months old. The child's eyes, and Caroline saw this from 20 yards out, were inflamed, swollen, and had the particular crust around the lashes that, in Charleston, in the 1880s, every doctor and every mother and every woman of any class knew on sight and dreaded. The child had trachoma. The child had had it some weeks. Sarah Tarlina was 23. She wore a calico dress and a black wool shawl in the Cherokee pattern, and her hair was in 2 braids tied with cord, and her English, when she spoke it, was the English of the Tahlequah Female Seminary, where she had attended classes from the age of 11 to the age of 15, before her mother had died and she had been needed at home. "Mrs. McGrath," she said, "Captain Adair sent a runner ahead of you yesterday. Come in. The kettle is hot." Caroline tied her loo to the rail. She took off her cloak. She set the Schofield on the table inside the cabin, butt forward, the way one sets a revolver in a strange house when one wishes to communicate that the revolver is present, but not, at this moment, in question. Sarah looked at it once and did not look at it again. The child on Sarah's lap stared at Caroline with the unfocused gravity of a sick infant. The child's name, Sarah said, was Leela. Leela was 14 months old. Leela had been ill since the 2nd week of March, which was the week the white men had taken the horse. Caroline asked, in a voice that did not betray, by Sarah's later account to a Tahlequah missionary, any change of priority, whether she might examine the child. She did. She had no medical training beyond what her mother had taught her. Her mother had been Quaker, and Quaker women of Charleston in the 1860s had been the closest thing to district nurses the city possessed. But she had seen trachoma. She rinsed her hands in the kettle water. She lifted the child's lid. She looked at the conjunctiva. She looked at the lashes. She set the child back on Sarah's lap. "I have a tube of zinc sulfate ointment in my kit," Caroline said. "It is not a cure. It will stop her from going blind in the next 6 weeks, if it is applied twice a day, and if you can keep her hands away from her eyes between applications. The cure is silver nitrate, and the only person within 100 miles who has it is the missionary doctor at the Park Hill Mission, and you will need to walk to Park Hill within the month." "It is 40 miles to Park Hill," Sarah said. "It is 40 miles to Park Hill," Caroline agreed. "I have an extra half-pound of sugar in my saddlebag. I have a stick of jerky. I have a clean wool blanket. I will leave you these things. I will also write you a letter which you will carry to the missionary doctor, which will tell him that he is to give your daughter the silver nitrate and the salicylate course at the expense of the Western District of Arkansas, payable to him through Judge Parker. I do not know whether he will honor that. I think he will." Sarah Tarlina looked at her a long moment. She said, "Mrs. McGrath, Captain Adair did not, when he wrote to me, say that you would be a person who carried zinc sulfate ointment in her kit." "My mother was a Quaker," Caroline said, "and my husband was killed on the 11th of September last by 3 men. I want to find them. The captain says you saw which way they rode out of your hollow. Will you tell me?" Sarah handed the child to Caroline. The child, who had been silent for the better part of the hour, began to cry, the dry, exhausted cry of a sick 14-month-old who is not strong enough for full crying. Caroline took her. She held her the way she had held Jamie that first night in the boarding house, palm flat against the small back, the child's head in the hollow of her shoulder. The child quieted within 30 seconds. Sarah watched. Then Sarah said, "They rode out on the trace that goes to the abandoned Methodist mission at Cabin Creek. The trace is not on any white map. I will draw it for you. They were 3. The youngest cried in his sleep on the 2nd night. and the oldest hit him for it. The middle one took my horse, which was a small grey mare called Ginny, and he tied her to his own pommel and led her out the door. I will not see her again. I want you to know that I am not telling you this for the horse. I am telling you for the youngest one's crying. A man who cries in his sleep has done something in the daylight that he wishes he had not done. That kind of man can be found if you know what to listen for at night. Where did they go from Cabin Creek? That I do not know. But there is a Choctaw freedman named Old Bill McAllister who runs a wagon yard at Veneta who will know, because they sold the grey mare to him on the 4th or 5th of April. And Bill will not have asked them any questions, but he will tell me where they went, because his wife and I are second cousins. I have written to Bill. Bill will be expecting you on the 2nd of May. Sarah, Caroline said, this is a great deal of trouble that you have taken for a woman you have never met. Sarah Tarlina looked at the Schofield on the table, and then at the child in Caroline's arms, and then at the doorway of the cabin where, in March, 3 white men had stood with their rifles unslung. She said, Mrs. McGrath, I have a daughter. You have a son. I do not know your son, but I know that you are not a woman who would have ridden into my yard with zinc sulfate ointment in her saddlebag unless she was a woman who loved her own child. So we are not strangers. We are 2 women who have, between us, 2 children who are too small for what is happening around them. That is not a small thing in the world. It is, I think, the only thing in the world that is not small. I have, in the years since I first read of this conversation in the deposition Sarah Tarlina gave to the Park Hill missionary the following winter, returned to that paragraph more times than I can easily count. I will not gloss it. I will only say that the next sentence in the deposition is the sentence in which Sarah confirmed that she had handed her daughter to Caroline McGrath, and that Caroline had held the child, and that the child had stopped crying, and that this had occurred in the cabin on the second bend of Pryor Creek on the afternoon of the 25th of April, 1886, between 5 and 6 in the evening. The deposition is in the Park Hill Mission Papers at the Western History Collection at Norman. The handwriting is the missionary's. The voice is Sarah's. Caroline left the cabin at sundown. She left the half-pound of sugar, the jerky, the blanket, the tube of zinc sulfate, and the letter to the missionary doctor at Park Hill. She also left on the table the small, pearl-headed mourning pin that had held the lace at her cuff, which was the only thing she carried of any commercial value besides the revolver and the warrant, and which she pinned to the corner of the child's blanket, without saying anything to Sarah, who did not see her do it, but who found it the next morning, and who, the deposition records, sat on the threshold of her cabin and held it in her palm, and did not speak for the better part of an hour. Halfway across the continent, in a small white clapboard house in Carter County, Missouri, an older woman in a gingham apron was, on the same evening, opening a letter. The letter was from her middle son. The letter said, in the careful, uphill hand of a man who had not finished the 3rd grade, that he and his brothers were well, that the work in the territory was satisfactory, that he would send $50 in the next post if he could find the bank, and that he expected to be home in Carter County by the 2nd Thursday in November, which was Thanksgiving. The hand was Marlon Hayden's. The mother set the letter on the kitchen table. She read it twice. She set the kettle on. She did not, by every account given by her neighbors to a Tulsa newspaper man in 1891 ever doubt for a moment that her sons would be home for Thanksgiving. She was, in this matter, almost correct. 2 of them were home for Thanksgiving. They were home in a different sense than she had been expecting. Caroline rode north and west from Pryor Creek for the next 7 days. She slept under the oilcloth. She kept the Schofield under her hip. She drew the gun 3 times, once at a sound that turned out to be a Cherokee farmer's hog, once at a sound that turned out to be a pair of light horse riders who had been sent by Captain Adair to track her at a distance for her safety, and once at a sound that turned out to be a man on a black horse, who would, 2 minutes later, identify himself as Deputy Bass Reeves and remind her, in the dry tone he had used in the boarding house at Fort Smith, that she had passed within a quarter mile of a Hayden camp on the previous night and had not noticed. "How did you know it was theirs?" Caroline asked. "They piss on the same side of every fire," Reeves said. "And the oldest one favors a kind of cheap rye that they only sell at the Veneta station. I smelled it at the camp. I would have smelled it at half a mile if the wind had been with me. Where are they now?" "Half a day west. They are riding for the Potawatomi country. They have heard that Captain Adair has put out a description of them in Tahlequah, and they think that the Potawatomi hills are out of reach. They are wrong about that. Captain Spring of the Choctaw Light Horse will meet you at the South Fork of Cabin Creek on the 3rd of May. He has been at it for a fortnight. And you, Mr. Reeves?" "I am riding for Veneta. McAllister at the wagon yard is one of mine. I mean, he is a person I have used as an informer for 6 years. He sent me a wire on the 20th. He has the description of the grey mare and the description of the youngest brother. The youngest brother bought a bottle of laudanum from the Veneta druggist on the 18th. He has been sleeping poorly. The druggist is also a person I know. The information is good. Then we are converging. We are converging in the manner of 3 lines drawn toward a single point on a piece of paper. The point is not yet drawn. But the lines are. He rode away. The thing that I find most striking as I read through the field notes and the depositions and the 3 private letters of Bass Reeves which survive in the Muskogee papers is the absolute lack of melodrama in the way these professionals discussed the closing of the trap. Reeves did not say to Caroline McGrath on that morning in late April that he had begun to revise his opinion of the project. He did not need to. He had been riding parallel to her for a week. He had pulled aside 2 men who had begun to follow her at the Veneta Ford. He had left, at one of her camps, a sack of corn for Halou, with no note and no signature. But the sack was the kind Reeves used, and the corn was the kind sold only at the Weber's Falls store. And Caroline knew. She thanked him by leaving on the same trail 2 days later a similar sack of beans. And after that, the question of his opinion of her was settled between them, in the manner that 2 grown adults of the same profession settle such questions, which is to say, without ever speaking of it. She reached Veneta on the 2nd of May. Old Bill McAllister ran a wagon yard on the east edge of town. He was 60-something, freedman, born a slave in Mississippi, escaped during the war, taken in by a Choctaw family, married into them, given his name by his Choctaw father-in-law, who had been named McAllister by a Scotch trader of an earlier generation, and who saw no reason that one McAllister less than the other should not exist. Bill ran a clean yard. He kept horses for travelers. He kept his ears open. He met Caroline at the gate with a tin cup of coffee, looked her up and down, and said, "You're the McGrath widow. Sarah wrote me. Sit down. She sat on a hay bale. Hallu drank at the trough. Bill McAllister sat opposite her on another bale. He had a piece of straw in his teeth. He chewed it. The grey mare came in on the 4th, he said. Sold for $12 by the middle one, Cyrus, the one with the bad left finger. The youngest one waited outside the gate. He did not come in. He has been drinking. The oldest one, Marlon, the one with the burn on the cheek, paid for 2 nights stabling for their own 3 horses. He paid me in federal certificates from the Potawatomi Indian Bureau. The Potawatomi Bureau is 140 miles south. He had been there in the last week. He had drawn money there. The money is from the Potawatomi Bureau, which means he has been doing business with someone at the Potawatomi Agency, and that someone is either a clerk or a contractor, and is either selling him information or buying something from him. My guess is information. Information about whom? Information about you, Mrs. McGrath. The Bureau gets the Fort Smith circulars. Your name has been on a Fort Smith circular since the 18th of April. The Hayden brothers know you have been sworn in. They have known it for 2 weeks. Caroline did not speak for some time. She drank the coffee. She set the cup down. She said, "Then why are they running west?" "Because they think you will follow the line of the circulars, which is to say, they think you will track them through Tahlequah and Veneta and into the Cherokee. They do not think you will turn south and ride into the Potawatomi country, because there is no white law in the Potawatomi that recognizes you, and they think that means you are safe to ignore in that direction. Marlon Hayden is not a stupid man, Mrs. McGrath, but he has the kind of intelligence that draws straight lines from one fact to another and does not, very often, draw curves. I am to ride south. You are to ride south. Captain Spring is at the South Fork of Cabin Creek tomorrow. He has the youngest brother in his glass. I mean, he has eyes on him. Daniel Hayden has separated from his brothers. He has gone south alone, with a bottle of laudanum and a horse that is going lame. He is sleeping in the open. He is in the country south of Tecumseh, in a half-burned Methodist mission shack that the older two used 6 years ago when they were running whiskey. The older two do not know that Daniel has gone there. Daniel is alone. How alone? Alone the way a man is alone who has not slept properly in 7 months, and who cries in his sleep when he does sleep. Caroline finished the coffee. She put the cup back on the bale. She said, "Mr. McAllister, I owe you a debt." "You owe me nothing, Mrs. McGrath. I owe your husband. He pulled my son out of the verdigris in the summer of '79, when my son was 9 and had fallen in chasing a turtle. Your husband did not know my son, and he did not know me, and the verdigris in flood is not the river to swim in. He pulled the boy out anyway. I have been waiting 6.5 years for the chance to do something for the family of the man who did that. Captain Adair did me the kindness of letting me know that the chance had arrived. I am pleased to have been useful." Caroline did not say anything. She got up. She put the Schofield in her belt under her cloak. She walked to Hallu. She mounted. "Mrs. McGrath." "Yes, sir. The mission shack is on a creek called Salt Creek, 4 miles south of Tecumseh, on the east bank. The creek runs west to east, against the usual run of creeks in that country. You will find it by the run. The shack has a fallen chimney. Daniel Hayden has been there since the 28th of April. He has, by Captain Spring's count, a Winchester carbine and a Colt revolver, and a horse named Banker that is not in condition to outrun anything that has been eating properly. He has, on his person, your husband's deputy badge. He took it when his brother Cyrus left the camp on the night of the 2nd of April. He has been carrying it since. He stole it from his brother. He stole it from his brother. That is correct. There is a thing in him, Mrs. McGrath, which is making him sleep with the badge in his shirt against his ribs at night. He may give it back to you without much fight when the time comes. He may not. But I have done what I can. The rest is your work. Caroline rode out of Veneta that afternoon. She rode south and west on the line Bill McAllister had drawn in the dust of the wagon yard with the end of a piece of straw. The line ran 110 miles. She covered them in 5 days. She did not, in those 5 days, see another rider. The country south of Veneta in early May of 1886 was the color of the inside of a clean copper kettle. The prairie was bronze with new grass. The bottoms were green with willow. The sky was the kind of clear blue that Eastern landscape painters of that decade tried, in letters home, to describe, and as a rule, gave up. On the 7th of May, Captain Spring of the Choctaw Light Horse met her at the ford of Cabin Creek. He was a heavy-set man of 60, half Choctaw, half Welsh, who had been a captain in the Light Horse for 30 years, and who had, by his own account, never in those 30 years arrested a white man. He shook her hand. He said, "Mrs. McGrath, the youngest brother is at the shack. He is alone. He is drunk. He has been drunk for 9 days. He has a Winchester carbine on a peg by the door and a Colt revolver under his blanket. If you go in with the revolver in your hand, he will fire. If you go in with the revolver in your belt and your hands open, he may not. The decision is yours. Is anyone watching? My nephew is in the brush on the north side. He has a Sharp's Big 50 across his knee. He will not fire unless you fire first, or unless Daniel Hayden fires. He will hold even if Daniel raises the carbine. He will hold even then. I have told him. He understands. He will fire when you fire, not before. He is 16 years old, Mrs. McGrath, and he is the best Sharps shot in this nation. And he is here because his father was at the Boggy Depot fight of '63, and he believes, as I do, that this is the same fight. Only the names of the men have changed. Captain Spring. Yes. Thank you, Mrs. McGrath. If you do this, when you come out, I will be at the ford. We will ride back to the Tecumseh stage station together. I will write the necessary affidavits in Choctaw and in English. The arrest will hold. Thank you. She tied Halloo half a mile from the shack. She walked the rest. She had the Schofield in her belt. She had the warrant folded into the breast pocket of her habit. She had, in the lining of the same pocket, the small daguerreotype of Jamie, which Mrs. Worcester had pressed on her on the morning she left Tahlequah. She had not, until that 100-yard walk through the bottomland of Salt Creek, looked at it. She looked at it now. She looked at the boy's small, grave face. A 10-month-old does not, in the still hold of a photographer's exposure, smile. And she put the daguerreotype back. She walked. The shack stood in a clearing of perhaps a quarter acre. The chimney had fallen. The door was open. There was a horse in the brush behind the shack, hobbled and indifferent. There was smoke from a small cook fire just inside the door. Not the chimney was useless, but a fire built on the dirt floor in the angle of 2 field stones. There was a man inside. He was sitting on a blanket. He was 23 years old. He had not shaved in 3 weeks. He was drinking from a brown bottle. He had not seen her. Caroline stepped into the doorway. She did not raise the Schofield. She put both her hands palm out at the level of her hips, away from the gun, and she said, in the conversational tone she had used at her father's dinner table 8 years ago, when she had wished to be heard above a Charleston gentleman's table talk, "Mr. Hayden, my name is Caroline McGrath. I have a federal warrant for your arrest, and a Choctaw light horse captain at the ford, and a Sharps rifleman in the brush. I am asking you to set down the bottle." Daniel Hayden looked up. Of the long moment in the doorway of the Salt Creek shack on the afternoon of the 8th of May, 1886, I have 3 separate accounts, and they disagree on small things. Caroline herself, in a letter to her father, written that night by lantern at the Tecumseh stage station, wrote that the moment was of perhaps the length of 3 breaths, though it would, in memory, expand. Captain Spring's affidavit, prepared 3 days later in his own English with the help of the missionary at Park Hill, said the interval between Caroline's first sentence and Daniel Hayden's first answer was no longer than a man takes to set down a bottle. The third account is Daniel Hayden's own, given on the stand at Fort Smith on the 11th of August, and Daniel Hayden said that during the silence he was deciding in his own head whether the woman in the doorway was real, because he had drunk a pint of cheap rye at noon and had not slept the night before, and had been, by his own admission, expecting either the deputy Bass Reeves or his elder brother Cyrus, and Caroline McGrath was, in his words, not what was supposed to be standing there. What he did was put the bottle on the floor. He put it down slowly with his left hand, and he kept his right hand visible at the level of his knee, and he said, "Ma'am, there's a carbine on the peg. I would like to set it down too. I do not have my hand on it. I do not mean to put my hand on it. But I want you to know it's there, because if I don't tell you, and you see it, you might think I was lying. I see the carbine, Mr. Hayden."
The Colt is under your blanket.
"Yes, ma'am." "Take them out, one at a time, butt forward, and set them on the floor by the door." He did. The carbine first, then the Colt. He moved the way a man moves who has been in a long fight with his own conscience and has decided in the past 5 seconds that the fight is over. He said, when the second weapon was on the floor, "Your husband, ma'am." "What about my husband, Mr. Hayden?" "It was Marlin who tied him. It was Cyrus who fired the first shot. I fired the third. I have not slept a full night since. I will tell that to your judge, if you take me to him." "That is what I am here to do, Mr. Hayden." "Yes, ma'am." "Stand up. Put your hands behind your back. Walk to the door." He did all 3 things. He had a leather wrist thong on his belt that he had used for tying horses. She took it, looped it once around his wrists, gave it a knot of the kind a Charleston seamstress uses on a difficult cuff. She did not draw the Schofield. She did not need to. Daniel Hayden walked out of the shack ahead of her, with his hands tied behind him and his head lowered, and he did not, in the half-mile walk to Captain Spring's horse, raise his head once. Spring received him without comment. The Sharps in the brush did not fire. The boy with the Sharps was 16 and would, in 1910, become the first Choctaw to serve as a Bureau of Indian Affairs field agent in Oklahoma. But on the afternoon of the 8th of May, 1886, he was a boy who had held a long, heavy rifle across his knee for 40 minutes without moving. Spring nodded at him once. The boy lowered the rifle. He let his breath out. He was, Spring would later write, surprised that he had needed to remind himself to breathe at all. They rode to Tecumseh at a walk, Daniel Hayden between them, on his own horse, hands now tied to the pommel. He did not speak. At the stage station, Spring wrote the affidavit, and Caroline wrote a letter to Judge Parker, which she sent by the next morning's rider. The letter was 3 sentences long. Daniel Hayden, the letter said, had been taken alive on the 8th of May at the Salt Creek Shack, was being held under Choctaw Light Horse Guard pending federal transfer, had confessed to firing the 3rd shot at the killing of Deputy Robert McGrath, and was willing to testify against his brothers.
The letter said one thing more.
She would not be returning to Fort Smith with the prisoner. The Choctaw Light Horse would. She herself would remain in the territory until Marlon and Cyrus Hayden were also in custody. She closed, Sum Cuique. Caroline McGrath, Special Deputy, Western District of Arkansas. Marlon and Cyrus Hayden were in the Potawatomi Hills. They learned, by the evening of the 10th of May, that their younger brother was in custody. They learned it from a Potawatomi clerk in the pay of someone. The records on this point are thin, but I am inclined to think it was a man named Stedman, who ran the trading post at Shawneetown and who had a quarrel with Marlon Hayden over the price of a sack of flour the year before. And they made, in the manner of men who have run out of options that do not involve violence, a decision. They decided to ride north and east into the Cherokee Nation and to ambush the Light Horse Party that was, by every reasonable estimate, going to be moving Daniel Hayden along the Tecumseh-Fort Smith Road within the week. They did not know that Caroline McGrath was still in the territory. I will not, in this account, draw out the next 4 months. The detailed record exists in Captain Adair's quarterly report to Judge Parker, in the field notes of Bass Reeves for May, June, July, and August of '86, and in 2 private letters Caroline wrote to her father from camps in the Potawatomi Hills. The summary is this. Caroline rode with Captain Spring's nephew, with the boy who had held the Sharps in the brush, and with 2 other Choctaw Light Horse men, in a 4-rider party which was not, on paper, anything to do with a federal warrant, but which was, in fact, the only effective pursuit of Marlon and Cyrus Hayden through the summer of 1886. They did not catch the older brothers in the Potawatomi. The older brothers had, by mid-May, learned that they were being followed and had turned south for the Choctaw Nation. Captain Spring blocked the Choctaw Road. They turned east for the Cherokee. Captain Adair blocked the Cherokee Road. They turned north for Kansas, which was outside Parker's jurisdiction, but inside the jurisdiction of a U.S. Marshal at Topeka, with whom Parker had been in correspondence since June. On the 3rd of September, 1886, Marlon and Cyrus Hayden rode into the small Kansas town of Coffeeville on horses that had been stolen the week before in a Potawatomi raid. They tied the horses at the rail in front of the general store. They went inside. They asked for sugar, salt, and a sack of cornmeal. They paid with 3 of the Potawatomi Bureau certificates, which Bill McAllister had described in April. The storekeeper, a man named Whitaker, who had been instructed 3 weeks earlier by a Topeka deputy to watch for these very certificates, did not change expression. He filled the order. He sent his son to the back door of the store with a sealed note. The son rode to the marshal's office. The marshal was a man named Edward Long, who had ridden the Kansas border for 15 years, and who was, by the careful arrangement of Adair, Spring, Reeves, and Parker, on the porch of his office that day, waiting for this exact note. Marlon and Cyrus Hayden were arrested on the porch of the general store at 3:15 in the afternoon of the 3rd of September. Marlon went for his pistol. Marshal Long shot him in the right shoulder. Cyrus did not draw. Both were on the southbound train to Fort Smith by the next morning. Caroline McGrath was on the same train. She had been at the Topeka office for 10 days. She had ridden the last 14 miles into Coffeeville behind Long's posse and had been, by the porch of the general store, the second federal deputy through the door after Marshal Long. There is a photograph, of which the only print I have seen is in the Coffeeville Historical Society. It was taken on the morning of the 4th of September on the train platform, of Marshal Long, his deputy, 2 prisoners in irons, and a woman in a lavender-grey traveling habit standing slightly apart. The woman's face is in 3/4 profile. She is not looking at the camera. She is looking at the older of the 2 prisoners. The older of the 2 prisoners is looking at the platform. The trial began at Fort Smith on the 11th of August, but the formal sentencing of all 3 Hayden brothers, for Daniel had pleaded guilty on the 11th of August in exchange for his testimony, and Marlon and Cyrus had been formally charged when they were brought in on the 4th of September, took place on the 28th of September, 1886. Parker sentenced Marlon and Cyrus to hang on the 18th of November. Daniel he sentenced to 35 years hard labor at the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth. Caroline McGrath sat in the second row of the gallery on the aisle, wearing the same lavender-grey habit she had worn on the platform at Coffeeville. She did not speak during the proceedings. She did not testify. Her affidavit had been entered in May. When the sentence was read, she did not, by the account of the court reporter, change expression. She left the courtroom by a side door. She walked to the boarding house on Garrison Avenue. She wrote 2 letters. The first was to her father. The second was to Captain Beau Adair in Tahlequah, asking him to deliver to Mrs. Ada Wooster the enclosed letter, the contents of which I do not know, because Mrs. Wooster burned it on the morning Caroline arrived back at the Stone House on the 17th of October, 6.5 months to the day from the morning she had left, 1 day before the warrant expired. Mrs. Wooster said, in a deposition many years later to a Tahlequah historian, that the letter said only what was needed to be said to a woman who had kept a child for 6 months. The letter, Mrs. Wooster said, was very short. She put it in the kitchen fire while the kettle was on. She did not regret it. Jamie McGrath was 11 months old when his mother returned for him. He had begun to walk. He had 4 teeth. He recognized her instantly by Mrs. Wooster's account, and he did not, that evening, sleep anywhere but in her arms. Caroline returned the bay gelding halloo to Captain Adair on the morning of the 18th of October, 1886, at the Tahlequah Light Horse Headquarters. Adair signed the receipt. He held the receipt a moment longer than was strictly necessary. He said, "Mrs. McGrath, the condition we agreed to. I have met it, Captain." "You have." "There was a second condition implied, I believe?" "There was." He took her hand. He did not, by any account I have, kiss it. He held it for the length of, by his own later writing, 3 breaths. The Charleston seamstress's knot on the wrist thong 4 months earlier had been tied for the same number. Then he let it go. "You will write to me, Mrs. McGrath. I will write to you, Captain Adair. You will not by any letter oblige yourself to anything beyond a correspondence. I will not. Should you wish, in the future, to consider any further obligation, you will inform me by letter, and the matter will be discussed in the customary fashion." by letter, until one of us is in a position to travel. That is agreeable to me. Then I will wish you a safe journey, Mrs. McGrath, and I will mention to you that the 18th of October next year is, by my calendar, also a Monday. She rode out of Tahlequah at noon. Jamie was in a cradleboard of Cherokee design, which Mrs. Worcester had insisted she take. The Schofield was in the saddle holster. The badge of special deputy was in the breast pocket of her habit. The badge was, by federal regulation, to be surrendered at Fort Smith on the morning of the 19th. She surrendered it. She also handed Judge Parker, in his chamber, a folded sheet of paper, which he opened, read once, and set on his desk. The clerk who recorded the meeting wrote in his daybook that the judge held the sheet of paper at arm's length for some moments before he spoke, that he then folded it and put it in the inside breast pocket of his coat, and that he said only, "Mrs. McGrath, the court is in your debt." The sheet of paper was the warrant. I have held that sheet of paper. The original is in the Western District papers at the Fort Smith National Historic Site, in a glassine sleeve in a folder marked simply McGrath, C. Special Deputy, April 17th, 1886 to October 18th, 1886. The warrant is unwrinkled. The expiry date is filled in, but not stamped, because the commission was returned the day before it would have expired. There is, in Parker's hand at the bottom, in the rapid forward-leaning hand he used when he was certain, the single word, "discharged." And below that, in pencil, in a hand which is not Parker's, and which I think is Caroline's, though I cannot be certain, "Suum cuique." She took the afternoon train east on the 19th of October, 1886. She did not return to South Carolina. She stopped in St. Louis for 3 days to see her brother-in-law, who had filed the document she had given him in April, and who returned it to her with a quiet handshake. She continued east. On the 23rd of October, she arrived in Washington, D.C., and called at the Department of the Interior on a matter relating to Potawatomi Bureau certificates and a man named Stedman at the Shawneetown Trading Post. The department interviewed her for 3 hours. The department thanked her. The department, in the spring of 1887, removed Stedman from his post and indicted him on 6 counts of conspiracy to embezzle federal Indian funds. Stedman served 4 years. Caroline did not return to Charleston for 9 months. She stayed in Washington through the winter, then in Boston through the spring, where she lived briefly with a cousin in a house on Beacon Hill, and considered an offer from the Mount Holyoke Board of Trustees to teach a course in Latin to the senior class. She refused it. In June of 1887, she boarded a train west. She arrived in Tahlequah on the 28th of June. Captain Adair met her at the depot. They were married 3 weeks later by a Cherokee Presbyterian minister of the Park Hill congregation in the Worcester Stone House, with Mrs. Ada Worcester as witness on the bride's side and Captain Spring of the Choctaw Light Horse as witness on the groom's. The wedding photograph is in the Tahlequah Historical. The bride is wearing the lavender-gray habit, somewhat repaired at the cuffs. The groom is wearing a light horse star and a clean, white shirt. Jamie is on her hip. He is 1 year and 6 months old. He is laughing. I have a copy of the photograph on my desk as I write this. It is not a large photograph. The faces are small. The bride is not looking at the camera. She is looking at the child. The child is looking at the camera. There is a goat in the background. The Worcester Stone House is behind them. I have stood on the porch where the photograph was taken. The porch is still there. The stone is the color of the ledge that the country in that part of Oklahoma rests on, which is a kind of pale yellow-gray. The grain of the porch boards, when I stood on them in the summer of 1979, was the same as it is in the photograph. The boards have not been replaced. Caroline lived in Tahlequah for the next 43 years. She and Beau Adair had 2 more children, a daughter Sarah, named for the woman at Pryor Creek, who had become, by 1890, the 3rd Cherokee woman to graduate from the Park Hill Missionary Training School as a nurse, and a son, Henry, named for Caroline's father. Jamie McGrath kept his father's name. He took his stepfather's surname, Adair, only at his own confirmation at 15, and only as a middle name, which he carried until his death in 1951 as a justice of the Oklahoma Supreme Court. The Schofield revolver, with the Latin motto on the grip, is in the Cherokee Heritage Museum at Tahlequah, in a glass case in the gallery devoted to the light horse, on loan from the Adair family since 1968. I have stood in front of it. The ivory of the grip is yellow.